Lauren, we're here together in the same building, but, because of microphones not in the same room. It's incredible to have you in Seattle.
Thanks. I'm really, really excited to get out of the heat in California, come up to Seattle, and get to hang out with you all for a little bit.
Nice. Yeah.
And as usual, I have a question for you today.
Okay. I'm slightly nervous, but yep, go for it.
All right. And so I don't know if I'm the only one that does this, but I sometimes like to amuse myself by thinking of friends that I've made, as an adult, and wondering to myself if I would have been friends with that person in high school. And so my question for you today is, what were you like in high school?
What was I like in high school? You're doing that to me?
Yeah.
Okay. I see how this is going to work. I see how this is going. It's funny. There is this photo that I've held on to that I still keep from me in high school. And I think in a way it sort of epitomizes what I was like. It's me in the woods somewhere in New England, and I've got long flowing hair, just not a good look. And I'm jumping over this frozen stream, kind of like above a waterfall, and there's like ice coming down the rocks. And I am like in big hiking boots, and I sort of look like I'm total. I think probably when we took the photo with my friends, I was like, I'm being a total badass. And then at some point, I was like, God, I look like such a dork. And now when I see it, I'm like, you know what? That's pretty cool. Like, it sort of epitomizes me at that moment in time of being a kind of kid who grew up. I don't know. I just I kind of was looking for something in life where I could have big experiences. And I would sort of figure out how to do that in creative worlds through music and through playing in bands. I was maybe like a shy kid in a lot of levels, being younger. And then there was this moment, I think, where it was like, no. I want to do things that make me feel something. And I want to do things that challenge me and that test me in a way. And it wasn't necessarily so much that I needed like the challenge, but I think it was just like I understood that doing something difficult created memory. And so I was that kid. And I think for me, probably by the time I was 16 or so, the outdoors were clearly something I was like interested in. And so I grew up I spent a bunch of my childhood in Florida, and there's this awesome 99-mile waterway through the Everglades that I like somehow became aware of, and I like wanted to do, and I was like, I got enough skills, I can pull this off. And I remember like writing a whole pitch letter to my parents and being like, this is why you should allow me to do. And like, maybe I could drive, but I certainly needed like their help on some level to pull that off. And I got like a firm no. I ended up like kind of leaving home at about 16. I was up in kind of like a smart kids boarding school. And at that stage, I was kind of like a little bit more independent. And I remember figuring out, I could take a few weekends off. I talked like a teacher into driving me like away from school to a trailhead, maybe like 45 miles away, that would link up with the AT, and then like hiking the AT back to a town that I could like hitchhike from back to get to school like over 3 days. And I don't know, they were just like these awesome, I think some of those memories like really define it for me, where I was just looking for those kind of experiences where I felt alive. And yeah, I don't know. That's kind of who I was then. And it's funny now because I feel like that's still kind of who I am now.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool story because I feel like that's a pretty common high school experience for folks, whether it's in the outdoors or not. But that moment when you really, when you're really looking to set out and define yourself and to challenge yourself and just kind of see what you're capable of. I think that's a really common experience, and it is definitely one that the boys in today's episode are looking for.
Yeah. Today we present Testing the Waters, a story about three best friends and a month-long river trip that puts their skills, stoke, and friendship to the test. I'd also say that their pitch to their parents on Excel spreadsheet was stronger than mine. So good job, guys. And yeah, I just kind of love this story because I think we all sometimes need to look at those photos and see ourselves at that age and realize that we could take a little bit of that many years later and apply it to our lives. I'm Fitz Cahal.
And I'm Lauren Delaney Miller. You're listening to the Dirtbag Diaries. This is a story about three friends
Luke Salters.
Job Dooley.
Jonah Albert.
from Franklin, Tennessee.
Jonah and I were in the same kindergarten class. And then in fifth grade is when Job started hanging out with us.
Who have known each other for a long time.
Since elementary school, we've always been best friends.
We've known each other for so long, so it's like we kind of have like a brother relationship.
And are used to getting into mischief together.
We always made potato cannons and all sorts of explosive contraptions. We made the underwater scuba setup for Job's pool and did underwater biking, and there was lots of tomfoolery to be had at Job's house.
Growing up, the boys had spent plenty of time on the Harpeth River, running through Job's backyard. They spent their summers fishing, kayaking, swimming, and building rope swings. But as high school obligations grew, sports, school, college applications, family, they found it harder to find time together. So when they managed to finagle a 3-day window of opportunity, they wanted to make the most of it. It was 2018, the end of their junior year, and one day they came up with their biggest idea yet.
What if we canoe and kayak from my backyard to the Cheatham Dam, which is like 80 or 90 miles?
I had about a 3-hour heads up from when I heard about this idea and until we were embarking on it.
Full of youthful enthusiasm, Luke, Jonah, and Job threw the trip together and were off.
It was Job's neighbor's canoe that his brother had borrowed once, and it had already flown off the back of the car and hit a tree. So there was a really noticeable dent in one end of it, and but that was the canoe that we took, and we just took a Pelican $100 kayak out of my backyard.
We just kind of were like, grab some food, toss it in a bag, and I think we slept just on tarps and just on the ground, and all got like pretty sunburned.
I brought a backpack that was soaked within 30 minutes of the beginning of the trip, and so all of my things were wet.
The boys shivered in the rain one day and roasted in the sun the next. But when they made it to Cheatham Dam, they were pleasantly surprised at how well things had gone. And like all good trips, they didn't want it to end.
We were always exclaiming how awesome it was to just be out on the water and not really have anything else going on. Listening to Doc Watson and eating corn from farmers' fields that was not ripe yet. But we just loved being on the water, and we wanted more of that.
After that trip, I think we were all, eating lunch together, and then just like, what could we do? We have a lot of time, the summer after our senior year.
That was really the tip of the iceberg, because we realized that the Harpeth connects to the Gulf.
The Gulf of Mexico, that is. More than 800 miles away, the boys saw potential on the other side of the Cheatham Dam. What was it like out there? And what would it take to embark on a trip that big? They were ready to test the waters.
We all kind of went home and talked to our parents about it. And if I remember correctly, I think they were the ones who organized a meeting for us to formally pitch a slideshow to them. And I think we kind of shot ourselves in the foot with that official presentation. We made a very humorous slideshow that was in a very flippant tone. I remember I was wearing a tuxedo top with swim trunks, and Jonah drank a bottle of sunscreen that was filled with yogurt. It's just very silly. And there was specifically a slide that was like dangers of the river, and it was like 3 slides on how dangerous hippopotamus were. And it was like, well, good news, there's no hippopotamus. So yeah, we definitely that initial pitch was very lighthearted, and I think it kind of made the parents double down on the preparation effort.
They were certainly very skeptical, and it was a good thing that they were.
The boys' goofy slideshow was not going to cut it with the parents, especially their dads.
I think one common thread between all of our dads is, in one way or another, they're very disciplined.
My dad's a unique guy. He's like, I feel like anybody that meets my dad kind of knows, like, he's a very military man. He's served in the military for 30 years. and he kind of has that like stern exterior, but he's like a big teddy bear.
My dad is maybe in some ways a little bit inverse of Job's dad. Like I think he doesn't have too much of a hard shell. He's a software programmer, and my parents are like really active ultra marathoners. I mean, you've never seen so many breakfast salads.
My dad is a lawyer, so the first thing he did was draw up a contract.
If the boys wanted to make this trip happen, there were going to be rules.
Otherwise, they'd come yank us.
I just pulled up the contract from my email, but it's basically that we had to wear our life jacket at all times. That we would have like periodic check-ins where they would like weigh us and like poke and prod us like doctors, and then determine whether we were ready to go back out.
We also had to call the Coast Guard and meet all the Coast Guard requirements with our boat before we could get on the water. And Jonah's parents made us get a VHF radio to contact the dams and other ships. My dad didn't know a ton about backpacking or camping or canoeing, so he knew somebody who did. That was our friend who was in the Delta Force. And so he was like, well, I'm going to ask David, like, what he thinks you guys need to bring, and that's what you need to bring.
The contract wasn't just for the boys, though. They were 18, and technically, they didn't need their parents' permission. But the boys were smart enough to know that they did need their parents' support.
Part of it is them agreeing to like help us to bring us food.
I think the families had been close for a long time. I think the trip also really brought everyone together in a big way. I think as soon as the trip was actually happening, they were just like totally behind us 100%.
The Canoe Boys, as they started calling themselves, they had a year to prepare. This trip would be the big send-off before heading out on their own, away from Franklin and each other.
I think there's like a blissful ignorance that when you're in high school, you think like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna be friends with my friends for the rest of my life. I'm gonna see them all the time, and it's like not as easy as you think.
Luke and Jonah would both be going to Mississippi State after graduation, but Job was headed to the University of Tennessee.
I don't think we were thinking about it as like, oh, we want to do this trip because we're not going to see each other as much after school. We were just doing it because we're like, oh, I want to go on a trip with my best friends. And then, I don't know, I don't think we were ever planning it as like a last hurrah or anything, but it kind of, in some way, worked a little bit like that. We started the trip, I think, 2 days after we graduated high school. So it was like, you know, pretty quick turnaround of like, oh, you have this life-changing event and then you're going to, you know, leave and go on the trip. So
we all had a shared graduation party the week before, maybe a couple days before we left. And I remember talking to a lot of friends and family friends and becoming a little bit agitated at the level of doubt that was like, oh, you guys aren't going to be able to do that. And I was like, yes, we can. You'll watch us.
We were really all chomping at the bit, especially combining the excitement for the trip with sort of the relief of being done with high school.
We all spent the night together at Job's house the night before, and specifically, I remember watching Deliverance the night before the takeoff, just to set the mood. I think we all tried to sleep for like maybe an hour or two, and then it turned into packing the car because we were just too excited.
The year prior, in their 3-day trip, they had used a borrowed canoe and a borrowed kayak. But this year, they wanted to come up with something special, something that would, quite literally, tie them together.
And then the boats themselves, we used my neighbor's canoe, and then Jonah's family had a similar, pretty much the exact same canoe. And so we brought them together. And then as far as like the customization, was really just like me and my dad worked out turning them into like the catamaran style, putting them together.
So imagine 2 nearly identical metal canoes fastened together side by side. In the middle, wooden planks about 3 feet wide span the gap between the boats and provide a little more room for storage. It seems solid enough, but there were a lot of unknowns.
I think it was maybe a little bit of a worry because we didn't know, like we could go and only be able to do 10 miles a day. I mean, from the year before, I knew we could do about 30 to 40 on like a really good day. But we also had a decent current on the harbor. So, I mean, definitely a little bit of an unknown until we got started.
On May 29th, 2019, the boys got on their boats on the Cumberland River just north of Cheatham Dam. picking up where they had left off the previous year.
It was a big send off, and then as soon as the parents were out of sight, I think the first day it was like really chilly rain and tons of mud, and it was like awesome. Like, here we go, starting out pretty miserable on that first day. Fingers are numb from the cold, but the excitement outweighed the discomfort for sure.
I guess like it's you kind of have to be optimistic because it's like you can't start out like being like, oh, this is going wrong, this is going wrong. But luckily, the part of the river we started on was like we were going downstream, and pretty quickly it turned into the land between the lakes area, which is like just kind of like a beautiful, calm waterway. It's like the perfect, and it's really easy to find good campsites. So that was like a really good place for us to start at.
Despite the weather, the boys managed to just about hit their 30-mile-a-day goal for the first few days. They cruised into Lake Barkley, where calm water and lush scenery served as the perfect warm-up. They expected to be out for about a month, and so far, things were going just as planned.
Lake Barkley it's huge and it's pretty glassy water. It's fairly calm. At certain points it can be 4 miles across. So it's a big lake, and there's osprey nests everywhere. So you're bird watching, it's easy canoeing. At that point the wind was at our back, and it felt weird to be going north trying to get to the Gulf, but I do remember the fog on the water in the mornings. You couldn't see 15 feet in front of the boat. So we were playing Misty Mountains, like the Lord of the Rings song, and it was really peaceful, and it was a great start to the trip.
That whole environment is incredibly lush. It's super duper green, and it's really packed with life everywhere you look. So it was just kind of gorgeous, especially for that first bit. And I remember early in the trip in the fog Luke mentioned, there was like a bird on a small island, and it was maybe a swan or something like that, but it looked really massive because of the perspective shift that the fog caused. So it definitely felt kind of settling into this magical world in some ways.
The catamaran canoe, however, posed some difficulties, as did all the traffic on the lake.
It took us about 2 or 3 days to really get steering down pat, because with 3 people in 2 canoes, we did 2 people in the back. So early on, we decided that we had to assign authority to one seat position, because all 3 of us were capable of avoiding a dangerous situation. But if we all acted on our own ideas, then there's confusion and hesitation, and then that only makes danger increase. So I think it was the first barge we avoided. We did it a little sloppily, and then we decided that okay, this is the authority seat, and we'll rotate seats every so many hours. But whoever's sitting here, they command the boat. And then the other back seat was the navigator, and the person up front was the mindless engine.
There were some other unique crafts as well. Like there was a guy with his pontoon boat towing a floating dock. So he was basically just parked in his dock and just driving it to one of the coves.
As they paddled along Lake Barkley, they wove between moments of quiet and moments of passing coves stacked with people partying on boats. Their plan had them heading north across the lake into Kentucky to connect to the Mississippi River. But only a few days in, that plan was starting to look, well, a little questionable.
Once we got up to land between the lakes, we had planned to take the Mississippi River all the way down to the Atchafalaya. And that year, the Mississippi River was in a 500-year flood stage, and barges were capsizing.
After one of the wettest winters and springs on record, in 2019, catastrophic flooding impacted the Midwest. Heavy rain continued into May and June, causing the Mississippi River to rise to record levels. There was destruction everywhere, and for the boys, it meant a serious reevaluation of their plans.
We were like disappointed. We had done, like you said, we did all that planning, and it was like, you know, the Mississippi River was something we were looking forward to, because it's like you read like the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and like it's like just a cool thing to say you like canoed the Mississippi River. So in that way, I was disappointed. I think me and Jonah are a little bit more stubborn than Luke. So once we started going the other way, we're like, this sucks.
To still reach their goal of getting to the Gulf of Mexico, the boys could take the Tennessee and Tombigbee rivers instead. But that meant paddling nearly 200 miles upstream through Kentucky Lake all the way to the Pickwick Dam.
And so that was kind of a turning point of like, we didn't know how much that was going to change, like how long it was going to take. Because we were all like looking forward. We were like, oh, we're going to get on the Mississippi. It's going to be like a crazy strong current, but now we're going upstream into a headwind for 200 miles.
Every day after day 7 was just pretty much totally unplanned.
The thing about paddling upstream is like you kind of feel like you're paddling fast because the water's moving by you pretty quickly and you're like really pushing hard. And then as soon as you see the land and you realize that somebody could be walking like twice as fast as you're going, it's like very humbling. And especially once we got closer to the dam that was like letting out water, we're basically on a water treadmill. We were really, really paddling hard, just trying to stay from going backwards.
Those were definitely the hardest days. And I remember spending an entire day with a bridge in sight about 25 miles ahead of us. And we spent the whole day trying to get to that bridge and we did not reach it. Like, it was disappointing to stare at the same bridge all day and not reach it.
We were definitely going a little slower than we wanted to, and like Job was saying, it was very defeating sometimes to be just inching forward all the time, especially with such kind of a drag heavy boat. But I think we compensated for that by trying to just be moving for as long as possible because we knew we weren't going to really increase our speed very much.
They were moving way more slowly than they wanted to, so they tried to make up for it by paddling even longer. Instead of the 9 or 10 hours of mellow paddling they had at the beginning, now they were rowing hard for 12, even 13 hours a day. And then, as they got closer and closer to the Pickwick Dam, they saw on the forecast that a big storm was rolling in.
We had gone all day paddling, still upstream, and we made it to this marina and got a meal there. And we were like, had a decision to make of like, do we paddle through the night? Because we knew there was going to be some storms coming the next day. So we kind of like sit there, eat at this restaurant, super nice owners, like gave us some t-shirts and we kind of had a turn of spirits and we're like, let's do it,
Yeah, it was definitely difficult to leave that marina and go paddle through the night because they were so kind. They offered us like showers and comfortable beds to stay in. So it was certainly challenging to leave Fisherdale.
And we get on the water and very quickly it's like pretty dark on the water. The water just is like black. It's like paddling through coffee.
Because there were storms coming in, there was total cloud cover. So really no night sky. And, you're just trying really hard to distinguish the tree line from the sky, and at times it's sort of impossible to do. And we had navigation lights on the boat, and we also had flashlights and everything, but we really wanted to conserve battery, so we would save our lights for when we needed to be visible to other vessels, certainly barges.
Luke, very early on, he's not a night person.
Yeah, I mean, I fell asleep paddling. Job and Jonah had to wake me up to tell me to lay down because my paddle wasn't touching the water, but my arms were moving and I was just out.
And then part of what makes it interesting too is the barges go at night as well. So they have big searchlights that kind of swing across the river. And when they see us, they kind of jerk over and spotlight on us, which kind of adds to like the eerie feeling of like paddling through the night along with just you're running on no sleep and you've been paddling for double digits of hours. We made it probably till like 3 a.m. and at that point Jonah was kind of drifting off. I was hanging on by a thread. Luke had been passed out for like an hour by then. And I remember seeing like there was some like a telephone light, but to me, it looked like it was like a New York City. Like I was like, what is that huge city? Like where are we about to paddle up to? And I'm like, we need to get off the water and just lay down. Paddling at night kind of just feels eerie because it's like, you feel like if anybody saw you, they'd be like, what are they, they're up to no good. So it kind of makes it automatically that kind of like projects onto yourself. You're like, everyone's going to think we're doing something bad.
But that was just a fever dream of a night for sure.
The boys finally relent. They paddle to the shore, set up their tent, and sleep through the next day's storm. When it clears, they decide to paddle through the night again, which, apart from the creepiness, is actually a welcome reprieve from the sun.
So we felt good. But I do remember that night we stopped for a snack break somewhere, and as we were snacking, our boat kind of drifted into this cove, and it like forever I'll still feel like the eerie spookiness of like that little area. It just felt bad, like wrong. It smelled like blood, and I don't know why, but it felt like a bad omen.
All of us at once kind of were just like, we need to leave this place. Like, it felt like if we turned on a light, like there was going to be just like a body. Like, that was like the only way we could describe it. It was just like such a eerie, weird feeling.
After that cove, we all started telling spooky stories to each other, and we came up with some scary ones. And those stories were in the back of our mind, and we found a spot on this flat water where you could yell anything you wanted to, and it would come back in a perfect echo. So like I think someone yelled like, "I'm not a real person," and it came back so crisp and clear that it gave us all the chills.
On day 15, the boys finally make it through the 200 miles of upstream paddling. They'd reached Pickwick Dam, which stretches almost a mile and a half across the Tennessee River. It was one of 13 dams they had to navigate on their trip.
So my grandfather, John Guider, he was a huge information resource for our planning. We went and had several discussions with him, and he was someone that was really critical on knowledge of how to get through the dam. So we had the VHF radio, which is just very high frequency. So it's a kind of line of sight handheld radio, and we would use that to contact the lock operators, and then they would tell us when we could go in, and just give us all the information we needed, and then we would go through the dam. There is actually a way to go through dams without a radio. At the end of the lock channel, a lot of times there's like a small rope that you can actually pull, and it will kind of tell the lock operator, hey, I'm trying to get in line to go through the dam. And it's really cool because it's a constitutional right to have free passage on major U.S. waterways as a citizen. And so we never paid a cent to go through any of these giant water elevators. But basically, how it works, so, the river gets stopped up and turns into a reservoir. And when you approach the dam, there's one section of the dam that is the like gates that they use to control the water level and let water through the dam. And then on the other side is your lock, which is where vessels will, go up or down, to get through the dam. And there's this long sort of passage that you go down, a corridor essentially, and there are these just giant doors at the front. And as you're approaching them, the doors just slowly open outward, and it's really impressive because you have the two water levels on each side of the dam, and they equalize the water level really, precisely, so that the even though they're giant doors, it takes very little power to actually swing them open. So then you coast into the actual lock, which is, it just looks like the biggest elevator you could ever imagine. And then before you know it, what was just kind of a room surrounding you is a giant shaft. And so you're just in this huge concrete room with massive metal doors, and we're just, there with our canoes. And so it was a really cool experience every time. And then they would open up the exit doors, and you would just go out.
The lock operators and all the boats and barges were like super cool with us. Like, you could easily see them just like wanting to be kind of being like, what are these people? Like, why are we going to waste our time? And they were all like, once we told them what we were doing, and like they saw us, they were like, hell yeah. Like, I think once like even a barge like let us go ahead of them, and like, cause it takes probably 20 minutes to do the whole ordeal. So, um, and we never had an issue with the lock operator. I don't even think we waited maybe more than like an hour or two to get through one of the locks. It was if anything, it was like not that much of an inconvenience and super cool to go through them all.
After the break, the Canoe Boys go with the downstream flow. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, it is that time of year. We need your shorts, your stories, because you power this show. We hear from so many of you that one day you're going to submit your short and send it to us at the Diaries. Guess what? That moment, it could be right now. So make it a New Year's goal or use it as an excuse to take a break from Uncle Joe at the holidays. You make this community, your voice is valued. You can find all the information you need at our website, dirtbagdiaries.com. Click on the Write Us tab where you can find instructions and the submission form. Pay attention to it. It helps the cause. Trust me. Link is in the show notes, so take a moment, click on it, consider it, and then get to work. You've got until January 19th to send us your short. Once again, it's dirtbagdiaries.com/write us. Thanks. Do you have a resolution to adventure outdoors more this year? Make it happen with Sierra Club Outings. Leaders in conservation-focused, active outdoor adventures, Sierra Club Outings hosts over 250 small group trips every year where you can backpack, kayak, raft, volunteer, and more. These trips fill up fast, so reserve your spot at sierraclub.org/outings and use the code DIRTBAG to get $100 off. With Sierra Club Outings, it's more than just a trip. It's an adventure with a cause. We'll put a link in the show notes. Check out all the incredible trips they have and make that resolution happen.
Now that the boys were cruising downstream, life became a little more steady. They'd cross back into Tennessee and then into Mississippi. They were nearly halfway to the Gulf, and the days were starting to blend together.
Sometimes we would put a blindfold on the person up front just to dip they would set the cadence of how fast we would go, but they would just paddle, take the blindfold off, and then wake up somewhere new. One of my favorite moments on the trip was there's this in Alabama, probably our stretch where we saw the fewest amount of people. They have these cliffs. They're called the White Cliffs of Eeps, which is like these like chalk cliffs, beautiful chalk cliffs. And we didn't have a great campsite because it's pretty much just a sheer cliff. But one night we found a little ledge. And so we pulled the boats up and get up on the ledge. And Jonah brought this little jaw harp that he would play. It was like the most peaceful, amazing moment of nature probably I've ever experienced, because it was just like nobody around. We found this perfect ledge, and we're just sitting there listening to some music and watching the sun go down. It's worth hearing him play it. Jonah is like a savant.
So this is a jaw harp. It's an interesting instrument. It's like really, really old and kind of used by different cultures, but in America, it's mostly used as like a sort of a rhythm instrument for bluegrass. And so for something like bluegrass, you might do like
I do think there were moments though where we relied on each other or like felt intense fear together and grew from that. One specific instance was I got bit by a black widow on the top of my foot and like had a high fever, like muscle spasms in my leg and hallucination. So I was just kind of having and definitely a panic attack on top of that. So that was like a good 3 or 4 hours one day of like them trying to decide like, do we need to hit the red button and have somebody out here come rescue him, or do we have a handle on this? And I was totally like relying on them. They were, constantly checking on my responsiveness and putting wet towels over my head to keep me cool. And that was a very stressful moment of the trip. That in hindsight, it's kind of funny, like to look back on how crazy that was. But in that moment, I definitely relied on them and they pulled me through.
After Luke's Black Widow scare, the boys carried on.
Very early on, we made kind of a rule, like no complaining verbally. So like if you were having a really bad time, you could let the others know by saying, "Man, I just love canoeing." One intense moment that didn't feel like it could be a trip ender, but it did suck, was like a 160-foot leisure craft that was heading upstream on the Tom Bigby. They were coming along at a quick rate, down up the river, and they were about to pass us, and we were trying to hail them on the radio, saying like, "You need to slow down, or your wake is gonna sink us." And they never responded. Jonah starts digging in the bottom of the bag for the flare gun, which is when we learned don't store your flare gun at the bottom of the bag. But hindsight 2020, and they passed us, and they were throwing a wake that was 8 feet tall, maybe. And so I remember our canoe flipped long ways, and I think Job was in the front, and I saw him catapult over my head, and then the whole canoe sunk, and so we had to swim out to get our stuff that was floating away, drag the canoe to shore, cut open a milk jug, and start emptying it. And that was definitely a damper on the day.
3 weeks in, the boys had canoed from Tennessee into Kentucky, back into Tennessee, through Mississippi, and into the final state, Alabama. Their families took turns resupplying them, even hopping in the boat to help the boys paddle for a few days here and there. As they inched closer to the Gulf, the landscape changed around them.
There were definitely a lot of bird life, which was really wonderful. Anything from sort of the small, perching birds to a lot of like blue herons or white egrets. And those were always really fun, herons specifically, because they would sort of, when they would get spooked by us, they would sort of move down the river, and then we would see them again later, and that would continue for miles. Sometimes you would see alligator gar in the water that would be, 4.5 feet long, so pretty large. They, really shoot out of the water when they're surprised, and they're pretty big fish.
So, for those not from the South, alligator gar are fish, some of the biggest freshwater fish in North America, in fact. They can grow up to 10 feet long with these huge mouths full of 2 rows of teeth. They are absolutely terrifying looking, but not actually dangerous, really, at all. But that's not all the boys were seeing in the water.
The alligators we didn't grow up around, so that was something where I was like, "This is," because I think the world's largest alligator was caught on one of the waterways we were on. So it was like that was something where like you didn't want to be in the water. Water, like you said, is not the cleanest, and all of the paper factories and whatever on the water don't really make you want to go like for a swim. But yeah, we didn't do a ton of swimming. We knew we were in alligator country once we started to see that the way that they catch them is they like hang ropes with like hooks on them from a tree, and so you can see like ropes hanging down, some with hooks, some with just where I guess they've caught one and then they just cut the rope. So it's like, oh, that's terrifying that they can jump that high out of the water, and we're basically 6 inches above, sitting 6 inches above the water.
I think it was after that like the 13th dam. As soon as we were past all the dams, it was a lot more gators. Um, but yeah, it was, and you started seeing a lot of mimosa trees. It felt like once we made it kind of into the Alabama, Mississippi, like halfway down those states, that we really started to enter like swamplands, lowlands, and started seeing a lot more of them.
My mom was not a fan of that one. But yeah, it was also cool how to like sort of learn how chill alligators are for the most part. I mean, certainly if you provoke one, it can get aggressive, but we would see alligators relatively frequently, and even if we were sort of on a collision course, they would just kind of mosey on out of the way. And I think a lot of times they're sort of too lazy to try and worry about us at all. But yeah, like Job was saying, we passed by the spot where the second largest freshwater gator was caught, which I think was maybe 12 or 13 feet. And so when you're in a 17-foot canoe, that's pretty crazy to think about an alligator that's almost as big as your boat.
As the days ticked on, the boys knew their time would soon be up. They became pros at passing through dams, cooking ramen, and battling headwinds. Some days were better than others, like the day they got an Uber to the nearest Waffle House. They were in awe at the kindness of strangers they met along the way, folks who fed them and gave them advice. As with so many trips, there were days when they wanted it to end, and days when they hoped it would go on forever.
You're kind of like brothers at that point. But so we definitely, you have to kind of temper messing with each other as much as you can, or as tempting as it can be. At a certain level, you realize that we can't really fight with each other because it's not going to do anything. Like, we're just going to be mad at each other. So I mean, we're sleeping in the same tent, and you're never more than 6 feet from each other in the boat. So you kind of just have to recognize that anything we're arguing over is just kind of silly. And we never really had huge, disagreements.
One thing they did disagree on, however, was exactly where the trip would end.
We had a little bit of a debate on where we were going to end the trip. We had picked an island early on called Dauphin Island in Mobile Bay, which is all the way at the end of Mobile Bay, which is like 30 miles away from the actual, like, where the river dumps into the bay. And I know me and Jonah were like dead set on going to it because we had said we were going to go to it. Luke was a little bit less, just because I think his parents they were one of the ones coming to pick us up, and they really didn't want us to do it.
Paddling out to Dauphin Island would create another day or two of travel, and a hard one at that. But
in the end, it was like 2v1. We were like, we're doing it.
Dauphin Island it is.
So we get through Mobile, which in itself was really interesting because it was just the biggest city we'd been through. We were passing by cruise ships and container ships. Like, our boat could fit in one of the rooms of the cruise ships. And we paddle through kind of along the shore, get like 10 or 15 miles in, and then we stop at a marina, and we're like, we're going to celebrate our last night on the trip. And one of the ladies working there, we had planned on camping at a bigger island in the middle of the bay. And she was like, don't go there. Like, there's 2 fishermen had just died there that day because of a storm.
They decided to stay closer to shore and find somewhere else to camp.
And so we find like a little beach, and are like, enjoying our last night of the trip, like watching the sunset go down. It's great. We're listening to music, like really like enjoying the time. And then a storm rolls in, and we're like, it was bad, like a really bad storm. It's lightning all around us. We're like huddled in the tent, like to the point where you're like, the only thing you can do is just sit there and like hope and pray. And finally we like come to the realization we're like, we can't stay any longer. So we get out of the tent, sprint down the beach. It's like a scene out of a movie where it's like just pouring rain. We're like yelling, like, and run down the beach. It was like covered in like barnacles. So we like cut up our feet trying to run. Finally get to like a shelter, somebody's house, and just like hide under there for a while. And then made it back to the tent, and luckily, everything worked out. But it was a strange end to like the last night on the trip.
On the morning of June 28th, the boys wake up early. The wind's blowing towards Dauphin Island, and they can break out a sail they had fashioned.
So by then we had added the makeshift sail to the boat, which really was just a PVC pipe in the center between the 2 canoes. We had built originally there was just the metal frame, then we had built a wooden platform, and then later we added on the PVC mast and the tarp sail, thanks to Job's dad. And so I was sitting in the middle of that platform, just trying to control the sail to get as much power and to just keep it working in our favor. And Luke and Job were really just making sure that we were aligned correctly with the waves. I think our boat handled waves really well because of its design. It would flex between the canoes and was just an incredibly stable craft. Biggest risk was just the boat being swamped because our gunnels were not extremely high off the water at all.
So me and Luke were in the back with just like milk jugs, like scooping water out of the boat using like one of those like super soakers that you have as a kid just to suck water out and squirt it out of the side of the boat.
It was stressful because the waves were there and Job had lost his contacts and could not see Dolphin Island even when we were quite close to it. And I do remember like steering was such a constant necessity that day that like I don't think I took both hands off the paddle to like get to my water bottle for that whole last day. It was a half day, but it was very hands on. Everybody giving it their all just to make it that last stretch. The ocean required a lot more awareness.
We made it. We think we did like 17 miles in like 4.5 hours, something like that, and cruised right into Dolphin Island. And then part of the reason we wanted to go to Dolphin Island was like we wanted to have that point where it's like you look out and it's just ocean, you know? And so we that was the motivation of like picking that island was like we didn't want to just dump out into the bay and then still see land. It was like we made it to the last point we possibly could.
31 days after leaving home, the boys have successfully canoed 800 miles from Franklin, Tennessee to the Gulf of Mexico. It didn't always go as planned, but they had quite the backyard adventure.
I think it was, you know, I think it was mixed feelings in some ways, but certainly just pure excitement in others. Seeing them and rolling in like we were in style with the wind and sailing, and I think there were also like there we had been on the local news there, and so we were just feeling really excited about it. At the same time, I think this was one of those trips where when it ends, you don't feel necessarily like you're just so happy to be done with it. It was so enjoyable that it's like, oh, I could keep going.
I think what was a cool thing, at least looking back on it, is that a lot of this trip we like kind of got to customize ourselves. Like, there's not like a guidebook on canoeing to the Gulf of Mexico from Franklin, Tennessee. So it was like, and from the boat we took, the route we did, like the way we organized ourselves, I think a lot of the ways we did things, like nobody would do it that way, but kind of adds to the way, our memory of it at least. I think a lot of times when you tell people about this, they're like, why would you want to do that? And it's like kind of a tough question to answer. I don't know. Like, there's certainly parts of it that aren't like, the typical type of fun, but we all, I think, have that like adventurous, put yourself in a challenging environment. And then, it may not be the most fun thing you've ever done in the moment, but at the end of the day, you're going to look back on it and be like, that was really cool. And, looking at it now, I'm super glad we did it because, it's a super unique thing that we, got to spend time, be in nature, spend time with our, people you enjoy being around.
Definitely part of it for me was a continuation of taking some of the experiences I had doing things outdoors growing up and just how can I do this in the biggest way possible. And having the opportunity to do that is something I'm so thankful for. And it really was a unique opportunity, and it sort of kind of takes you out of the normal world for a minute and puts you in this place where you can just take in your surroundings and you can have a very, very simple life. And that isolation, I think, to me was very revealing of what was truly important to me, what really mattered, and the things that stuck with me and stuck in my mind through that trip to give me motivation were sort of internal parts of myself rather than external expectations or labels or pressures, that you might see in your normal life.
I think I just wanted a challenge. I wanted to experience a few extremes, um, and just get out and explore the world and prove something to myself. Yeah, I can do crazy big things and hard things, and gain knowledge, experience, and fulfillment from that. And so, who better to do it with than my two best friends who I've already done the rest of life with.
Thank you, Luke, Job, and Jonah, for sharing your story. After the trip, the Canoe boys went off to college. Things changed, but not their excitement for adventure. The following summer, they biked over 1,200 miles from Franklin to the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. Nice work, y'all. Our stories come from friends of friends, and from you, our community. If you have a compelling idea for a guest or story, please give us a shout. You can use the submission form on our website, dirtbagdiaries.com. Music today from Brian Bombadil, David Swenson, John Barry, Quincy Coldwater, A.R. Jacobs, and Brendan O'Connell. The tracks are courtesy of the artists or track club. You can find all the information on our website. Jacob Bain and Nice Cotto composed our theme song. This episode was produced by Lauren Delaney Miller with additional production help from Andrew Burton, Ashley Langholtz, and Becca Call. Illustration by Walker Call. Becca Call is our executive producer. I'm Fitz Call, and you've been listening to the Dirtbag Diaries. Thanks for tuning in.